So initially I had suggested that we actually talk about the regular basics in Outlaws. We have been covering the full art basics for every set, but I really like the ones in this one.
They are very nice.
And I just kept thinking about it, and we've touched in past videos on what various types of cards represent in the game, particularly the Ixalan, the creature lands, what does it mean? So that was a whole thing. So I've been thinking about what do lands actually represent in the game. And I really want to talk about that before we talk about the basics.
Let's talk about that.
And my thesis statement that I've concluded on is that Magic is a really unique game in that its representation of place or setting is exactly equal to its primary resource system. And I don't know of any other games like that. Like a lot of games, everything from chess and tic-tac-toe have place, or not setting in that case, but they have place. They happen on a physical space, and where things are is like the whole game.
It's more about positioning than the place itself.
Yeah. And pretty much every video game genre has a map that you're in. I mean, like racing games, the only thing you're doing is maneuvering around in space. But first-person shooters, real-time strategy games, just almost everything has a place that you move through. And that's just integral to the game experience. A lot of times that is the game experience. Old side-scroll, like Mario Brothers, the original, those, like the level, the map define your experience. That's most of what you do is interact with that. And that's what provides the difficulty. Then in card games, some of them don't represent place or terrain or maps at all. Back at the beginning of collectible card games, when Magic was new, there were some competitors. Wyvern is probably something you haven't heard of unless you were really into games back then, but it had a resource system, and that was gold, and it had terrain cards, which were just kind of like, I think they served more like a removal type of thing. Pokemon is one of the older generations of games. It doesn't really have place at all, does it?
Not really. They have stadiums. I've played some Pokemon. It's been quite a while since I've tried playing the card game, at least. They have something called stadiums that function kind of like enchantments. So they're not so much... they don't really function in that way where place or setting is important. They might reference a place that exists within the context of the video game.
But that feels like the kind of thing I am getting at.
Yeah, it's sort of that.
Where is the game happening, or where are the characters?
In that one, though, it is less of a setting for the game and more of a, like the way enchantments work in Magic, where it's like alluding to like, oh, this is a place.
Yeah.
And it's not so much the game happens there or that affects the resources. So it's kind of adjacent, but it doesn't really affect the resource or the setting of like, where is this happening?
Okay. And the resource that's in that game is just completely abstract.
Just energy, which is just kind of an abstract concept.
And what I'm getting at is that Magic, functionally, the lands really just are an abstract energy source. They don't really need to be lands.
Yeah, I mean, like they could be called something else, and that would not affect the game.
But then a lot of other card games do have location or place. Like Lorcana just introduced their, I don't know if they're called locations, but there's a location card where you can move the characters.
Okay, I've purchased exactly one deck, so I didn't know that.
One Piece is one that we both play, and that has just there's no location involved there, right?
Yeah, there are some cards that are kind of, I forget their forget what they're called, but you can play one and it just stays out, kind of like an enchantment. And it'll reference a place, but like the battle that you're having is not set in any particular area. The energy system in that game is also, it's called Dawn, and it's also kind of an art, like
it's abstract
it's
just the resource.
It's the resource. It actually exists in its own deck, so it's not even in your main deck.
Right.
Which is a little bit different. And I figured we'd get into that a little bit, how the lands are mixed in with all your other cards in Magic versus some games, Pokemon kind of does that with energy too, where it's all part of your deck.
I didn't have that on my list, but like that is...
Yeah, versus there are some other games like One Piece, there's a couple others too, that don't utilize that system. It's either separated or they have some completely different way around, like you're milling cards in some games to create energy, or you're discarding cards from your hand to create a resource.
Yeah.
So it is very, in that sense, like literally interwoven with the game that you're playing. Like the lands are part of your deck.
Yeah.
He also mentioned like Hearthstone. And,
Hearthstone's another one that just doesn't really. I haven't played much of it, so maybe they do have location cards or something. But their resource system completely independent. It's not in the deck either. It's just you get a gem each turn or whatever.
There's a League of Legends of Runeterra has a digital card game.
Yeah.
Which kind of has a setting, but it doesn't really matter. Like you can go to different places within the game.
Yeah.
It just doesn't change anything about the game you're playing.
Huh.
Like, it changes the enemies you're fighting.
Oh, okay. So
it kind of affects it in that, but like it doesn't change the core mechanics of the game.
But it's like traveling to a different environment.
Yeah, you are going to like, okay, I'm going to go to this region and I'm going to fight this boss here. So there's kind of an effect.
I think that's totally a representation of place in a game.
Okay, yeah.
But Magic
it's flavorful without really...
But I mean, changing what you're fighting is a change in the experience of the game. In the same sense that if you're in Zelda... and you're in the starting area, you have the same controls for your character. You'll just fight a lot weaker enemies. But if you go to a different place, everything looks different aesthetically. And the enemies are harder.
Yeah.
So
you're going to face different kinds of enemies.
Right.
So yeah, in that sense, it does kind of affect... It affects your experience of the game.
Yeah. But in Magic, it's just this complete abstraction. It's just this resource. And there are some minor deviations, like right now, deserts.
Yeah.
The current crop of common deserts, they do damage. So that's a little bit different.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a side note.
Yeah, that's not their typical function.
And the closest example I could think of was the old Star Wars game, which was like contemporary with beginning of Magic by Decipher, and there have been like 2 or 3 Star Wars games now. But in that one, locations and the space of the game was absolutely crucial. It was, you start the game by picking a location out of your deck and putting it on the board, and then you move. Whenever you play characters or starfighters or capital ships, they go to a location, and they move back and forth. And then this is the only system where it is actually tied into the resource system, because you get a certain amount of resources per turn based on how many of those you control. But again, that's not like Magic, because that's more invested in, or it's more of a representation of space as part of the actual game mechanics. In Magic, it's sort of like the space is just flavor on top of the resource system. And like I said, I can't think of any other examples that are quite like that. There's plenty of games that have space or location in the game. There's plenty of games with resource systems, but there is none where they are equal, completely the same thing, and that space or setting doesn't have anything else to do with what actually mechanically happens in the game you're playing.
Yeah, I can't think of any off the top of my head. Magic is kind of unique in that way.
Yeah, and so I think that has some advantages in that it means, like you said, that's a third of your deck most of the time. So you have a way for the artistic team to present a setting for the set you're in, or the set you want to choose your deck to represent. If you're in Command, you're trying to... I mean, it's a big deal to choose the right basics for your Commander deck, right?
I've even drafted with people that will bring their own lands for draft, and are very specific about the ones they bring.
That would be me. I picked my favorite jumpstart lands. So I have,
it's not limited to, like, it is an opportunity for expression that's kind of interesting.
And for world building. But that's where things stand now. I was thinking about, how did we get here? How do we arrive at this kind of bizarre confluence, or this bizarre overlapping of place and the resource system? And there is pretty clearly an answer in this ancient tome, which is the The Pocket Player's Guide, and I believe I've had this since like 1994.
I was going to say, when was this published?
Which the year it was copyrighted in. The first third or so of it is by Richard Garfield, the original designer of the game. A lot of it is a recounting of just his thoughts and his experiences going through the design. He talks about starting like 10 years before some of the games he had designed much earlier that he drew elements from.
And he has continued to design games post Magic. I think he's behind Keyforge.
Yeah.
And he's done a number of other ones too. So he didn't stop after Magic.
No. And he's come back and designed quite a few expansions as well. I mean, he designed Arabian Nights right away.
I want to say he also collaborated on Dominaria.
The United or the
Not United,
Dominaria?
like Dominaria.
I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
I think he comes back with decreasing frequency over time, but he's been on the design team for a lot of these.
We'll have to fact check that, but I have this vague memory that he was involved in the design of Dominaria.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, because that is kind of the historical, that was the revisiting, like, we're going back to Dominaria.
Yeah.
So we brought Richard Garfield along.
Yeah. So I'll try and put the link in the notes for this video. You can just go check this book out from virtual libraries and read all this yourself.
I might actually do that. That seems kind of fun.
Well, you can borrow this copy.
I could borrow this hard copy, but you can go to
But I'm
going to
read some of the excerpts that kind of explain what he had in mind for why the lands are the resource. And I don't have this one bookmarked, but earlier he mentions that the first game he references was called The Five Magics. So, and that was something he said he designed in like 82 or 83, 10 years before working on this. Great take. So I developed the idea of Dominia, not Dominaria. Dominia was his word for the multiverse at the time. An infinite system of planes through which wizards travel and in search of resources to fuel their magic. And then the resources of a plane can be called upon by lines which connect to that plane. These are invisible except to one who knows how to perceive them. The lines carried by a typical wizard will connect to many worlds of Dominia. So I think he never uses the term ley lines, and I know ley lines are a type of card in Magic, but they're a concept that predates Magic. They're just a metaphysics concept that exists.
If you've read any amount of fantasy or metaphysics, I mean, this kind of thing comes up repeatedly, that there are ley lines or channels within the world or wherever you happen to be that carry this magical energy.
Yeah. And then also, these planeswalkers, often called wizards, have learned to travel between planes. Most have also developed secret methods of tapping the resources of one plane for use in another. Wizards covet the special resources of the various worlds, and rich worlds are guarded jealously. And I think this... We're going to see how this plays out in this work of fiction that he also included in this, the first Magic short story. But he really leans into this concept of the main thing that is happening when players are dueling each other is that you're trying to steal each other's mana, their resources, their ley lines, which is interesting. And it doesn't really play out.
Yeah.
But also in these notes earlier, before... Well, we know about ante, right? Most people have heard of ante, that in the first few years of the game, there were cards that said added extra card of ante. And so you would start the game by picking a random part of your deck that was the ante for the game, and whoever won kept the ante cards. But Control Magic originally stole like 2 and 2 blue to take control of the target creature. That stole ownership of the card. Like, you cast that, you own the card. And there were apparently other variants on that for other permanent types. So his original design for the game had a lot more exchanging cards within a community of players by force. I think it's pretty obvious why that fell by the wayside.
Consent.
Right. But so there was just a lot more of that in the early flavor of the game. But then, like I said, there's this work of fiction, Rorika's Tale, I think it's called. Rorika's Tale. That's just kind of a description of a duel in his words. And it includes... She reached in front of her with both hands, as if she were preparing to play an unseen harp. I had seen this before. She was gathering her lines for battle. And so it describes visually these basically ley lines, and the rest of the story, which I don't need to read the whole thing here. Like I said, you can get to it yourself. It has lots more examples of just describing these lines and how they get braided and everything. Cool. So that's what he had in mind. He had a much more literal sense of these lands that are in your deck. They are places you, the player representing a planeswalker, have visited and kind of made yours, and only you can use them.
I don't know if it gets into there, but like that was when I got into Magic and I was reading about the concepts of like what's going on in this game. Like it's called a library, we have graveyard, all these different things. That the idea behind summoning creatures, specifically legendary creatures, that part of that was that like these are people or characters that you've encountered in your journey, and so you're summoning kind of a concept of them or an idea of them. It's not the character themselves.
Well, I think originally it started in a lot more problematic fashion. I mean, it's a really dark concept when you think about it. You're summoning these things to do your bidding, but the way he describes it here is not flattering to the actual planeswalkers in the thing. They are summoning these creatures and from another plane, which they explicitly said,
like you're just yanking them out of existence.
No, the perspective of the story is like a familiar of the planeswalker, and so you're seeing it through this familiar's eyes, who's clearly not human. Is described as having
So you're
fur.
saying every time I summon Reassembling Skeleton, I'm like yanking him away from his job at the coffee shop and just like thrusting him out.
As Garfield intended.
As Richard Garfield intended.
Originally, envisioned rather.
So when I throw him on the Phyrexian altar, I've just really derailed his day.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the next step along the way is one of the novels. This is the second novel that ever came out. So there were 10 novels by Harper Prism, who I guess licensed the IP. Eventually, Wizards took over the ownership of the novel and the creative universe themselves, and that's called, post-revisionist, and this is pre-revisionist, so these first 10 novels. But it's clear these authors coordinated with Wizards. I don't know if they talked to Richard Garfield directly, but in the first novel, I haven't read these recently, I read them when they came out, which was 95.
First one's Arena?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And, so I found some quotes about Magic in Arena, but they were a little bit abstract. And the one I found here from the perspective of an experienced wizard, because the protagonists here are either non-magical themselves, or they are newly discovering that they have magical potential. But they are talking to this actually an antagonist who has just discovered this object with the protagonist's help, and says, it's a mana vault. It stores magical energy. Mana! Magic is everywhere, in the air we breathe, the water, the land. But magic's spread thin. This thing stores mana, the way a purse holds gold. A whole land's worth, ready for the magic user who needs it. So he's coveting the mana vault because he's categorizing it as a whole land's worth. So this feels like a bit more abstract a concept of what mana is and what lands represent than what Garfield had written himself, but it's still in that vein. And
this is going to make me think about lands really differently the next time I'm playing.
Well, I think basically what happened, and like I said, I've probably read half of the Magic novels ever printed as they came out, but I've kept up with all the short stories recently, but it's been a while since I read all the others. But I think that as of the point that things became post-revisionist, when WotC took over the novels themselves, I think they basically abandoned trying to have that specific description of the mechanics of what's happening in the metaphor of the game. All of the inner monologues we hear from characters now, and the way they talk to each other, it's when it addresses how they're thinking of using magic at all, which usually don't. They just say, I used magic, or so-and-so did something magical.
And then this happened.
Yeah, but I think it's in more abstract terms now. It's like, I summoned all my energy, right? It's...
Well, if they ever make a Magic anime, they're going to explain it to death. It's required. But...
Well, that's an interesting... Yeah. Do you want it now?
Huh?
Do you want that to happen?
I don't know. Well, okay, I did when the trailer for Neon Kamigawa came out. That made me really want a Magic anime, but just because I want to see a Jin Gataxias fight scene. I had never considered how he would move physically, and that trailer just blew my mind.
I don't remember the answer to that. I'm gonna have to go watch that.
Well, we're
gonna
have to watch it later. It's very important.
But since you brought it up, and it doesn't have to do with lands, but the kind of ethics of this. This trilogy starts off with the protagonist's innocent little village in the woods is suddenly beset by two wizards fighting and gets absolutely destroyed by all these summoned creatures. And the wizards finish and leave, and the creatures are all still there, and the villagers hate these creatures, and then they discover the creatures have all been enslaved against their will. And that's how magic works.
Here we are.
Yeah, and so, again, I think it's probably really good that as WotC took over the game, they kind of abandoned that, because
like,
by
maybe
that
we
logic,
want to de-emphasize that aspect.
Yeah, it's really bad. And it's weird that this game came to be, and both the creator and the first novelist all just decided, that's the way this works.
That's what's happening when you do this.
Yep. So that was weird. Yeah. So then I think we arrived at the state I was kind of describing earlier. We're in the modern era of magic world building and fiction. The mechanism by which lands are producing mana is just kind of there.
Yeah, like it's just something that's just part of the game. It's not something that we really seem to explore or spend time on anymore, as far as like what's happening when you tap a land for mana or what that represents.
Yeah. There was another, I think, kind of conceptual problem with early Magic, which was later keyworded as Island Home.
Okay.
And that wasn't on the text of the card, but like Sea Serpent at first said this. I think Sea Serpent said this is basically buried if you don't have an island, and it can't attack unless your opponent has an island. So if the mana is just some remote thing that you're tapping on for energy, why is it suddenly the place the thing is happening? And that's clearly the flavor of that card, right?
Yeah.
That you can't
like,
have this sea creature unless you have a sea for it to live in.
That says to me, like, this creature can't exist. Like, if I summon it and I don't have an island or a sea for it to be in, it ceases to be.
So that implies...
Which makes sense, but doesn't really vibe with what we've kind of looked
or anything
at so
else
far.
throughout the game.
Yeah, or any other feature.
They could have really leaned into that.
Yeah.
But, again, Magic has never actually said your characters go on this land. That's just not the way it's been set up. That's what I mean by it being an abstract resource.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And of course there's
that does kind of bring me to mechanics like Swamp Walk.
Yeah.
Which kind of implies that there is a physical location
that's absolutely true.
That we are traversing.
And those were really prominent in the beginning of the game. So I think basically the early game just didn't have all of this entirely ironed out. It wasn't entirely cohesive. And I mean, they still make a lot of compromises between flavor and mechanics. And generally I think we as the player base realize that and just accept some things are going to be more flavorful.
The game has years of history now. Like, things are going to change. Things are going to have to adapt. It would be pretty boring if they didn't.
Yeah.
And, I imagine, like, many things, not everything is ironed out in the beginning.
Yeah.
You know, obviously they've tried different things out over the years. Some things have stuck. Some things haven't.
Yeah. Before we move on to the kind of final chapter in that development, I just want to show off these because it's relevant. These people may be aware that these first 4 novels had this special offer here where you can send off to get a card, and I sent off and got all the cards, and I do not have either of the most valuable ones anymore. I'm not really sure what happened to them. I have these 3. I have a Giant Badger, a Windseeker Centaur, and a Sewers of Estar. Each are worth a couple of dollars. You know what the big one was that I don't have anymore? Mana Crypt.
Oh, wow.
$300 plus. And I'm pretty sure I just traded that away in 1995, 96.
As you do.
However, I traded for a Bayou around the same time, and I still have that one, so it all kind of came out of the wash.
I think that's a net gain.
It's close.
Yeah, I think that's a gain.
Yeah, I don't know. The mana... Oh, sorry, the Bayou is really dirty on the edges, though, so...
Well, maybe not. It probably is out.
In any case, there's kind of a final chapter to the progression of how the published lore is treating that, and that is Gysen Geralf's short story from Outlaws. And it opens with a bit of Geralf's journal, which describes his theory about how magic users are getting their magical energy from the lands of their plane. And so he's, I guess, just become aware since the events of March of the Machine that all these other planes exist. So I'll put this on screen too, but I'll read it as well. Even as an emptied wine bottle will have traces of wine remaining on it to flavor the next liquid it contains, it is my belief that those who tap into planar energies are vessels of a kind. We are filled with the power of the planes where we are born, and while on those planes, we renew that power regularly, preventing it from becoming dilute. Should we leave our original domains, we will begin to water down the energies we contain, diluting it until one day the original magic can no longer be detected and has been entirely replaced by the energy around us. To travel too long between planes is to risk the loss of your original alignment and acquire something new. So that says a lot potentially interesting about where card design might be going, and maybe legendary creatures changing colors and factions and personalities or something. I don't know. I don't know what this is really, or if this is just the wild ramblings of a overly self-assured Stitcher.
It could be either.
But it's interesting that it's a new attempt to kind of flavorfully tie land and mana to magic users.
Yeah. And this is an interesting time in the story to be doing that now that everything is kind of opened up with the Omen Paths, and we're seeing all these different legendary creatures, and not just planeswalkers, traveling to new places they've never been before.
Yeah. So, that's kind of the history of land's mechanical explanation, or the melding between mechanics and flavor. But I feel like I've already kind of stated this, but I think gives the creative team a particularly wonderful opportunity to flesh out with each set what this world is like, what the setting is like, and all the decks can play those lands. All the decks can include the setting.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that is such a unique and wonderful opportunity for the creative team to be able to not only show what the environment of a setting is, but I mean, lands are necessary for your deck to work. I mean, there's a few outliers like Manaless Dredge in certain formats, but for the most part, I mean, you're going to be playing with some basic lands. You know? And yeah, they're wonderful little artistic windows into what's going on a plane outside of the activities of legendary characters or other artifacts, enchantments, other things that represent people or objects from the world. And just kind of give us a sense of when we look at the lands for Outlaws of Thunder Junction, just what neat little snapshots into the world that we're exploring here.
Yeah. Let me bring up the basics from this set.
Yeah, that kind of segues into our next section.
Yeah.
Basic lands of Thunder Junction.
My image viewer will behave.